My son thought I was just a frail old woman, so he tricked me into signing a paper that gave him my $1 million home. He told me it was to protect me, but that night I overheard him on the phone, calling my home an asset he needed to sell by Friday to save himself. He made the biggest mistake of his life. He underestimated me, and he had no idea that I was about to deliver the perfect revenge in the one place he felt safest. It all started on a Sunday the way so many quiet disasters do. Kevin and his wife Ashley came over for brunch. The California sun was streaming through the bay window in the kitchen, the same window I'd watched my son grow up through, from a toddler chasing butterflies to a teenager sulking his way to the garage. They were a whirlwind of energy, all bright smiles and loud compliments. He kept saying how much he loved this old house, how they just don't build them with this kind of character anymore. Ashley would chime in her voice a little too high, talking about the good bones of the place. But their eyes told a different story. As they spoke, their gazes weren't on me. They were scanning the walls, the high ceilings, the half-acre of garden out back. It wasn't the look of nostalgia. It was the look of an appraiser, calculating, measuring, assessing value. Kevin, my brilliant, charismatic son, couldn't sit still. His phone was a permanent extension of his hand, and he'd flash a tight, apologetic smile before glancing down at it every few minutes. I could see the tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that his cheerful chatter couldn't quite hide. I told myself it was just the pressure of his startup, the high-stakes world he lived in. I just didn't realize those stakes were sitting right at my kitchen table. In the weeks that followed, their concern for me ramped up. It started small. Ashley insisted on doing my grocery shopping, saying I shouldn't have to deal with the crowds. Then Kevin installed a new state-of-the-art security system. He told me it was so he could have peace of mind knowing I was safe. It came with an app, he explained, that let them monitor everything. They could lock the doors remotely, check the cameras. It was for my protection, he said, but it felt like I was being quietly cordoned off from the world. My neighbors would drop by and find the gate locked. My calls started going through Kevin first, who would explain that he was just screening for scams. Every move was framed as an act of love, of dutiful care for his aging mother. I felt a growing, suffocating sense of unease, a feeling I couldn't quite name. It was like the walls of my own home were slowly, politely closing in on me. The day it all came to a head, Kevin arrived with a leather-bound folder and that same high-wattage, reassuring smile. He told me he'd had a lawyer draw up papers for a family trust. It was just smart financial planning, he explained, a way to protect the house from taxes and legal complications down the line. He spread the documents across the dining room table, a sea of dense legal jargon. He talked fast, pointing here and there, his voice a smooth, confident hum. He made it sound so logical, so responsible. He was just looking out for me, for the family's future. I felt a little overwhelmed, my engineer's mind struggling to keep up with the legalese he was glossing over. When I tried to ask a question, he'd put his hand on mine and say he had it all covered. Trust me, Mom. Those 3 words had always been my bedrock, so I trusted him. I picked up the pen, my hand tracing the letters of my own name on page after page, signing away the very foundation I was standing on without even knowing it. That evening, the house felt strangely quiet. Kevin and Ashley had left their work apparently done. I was watering the roses in the garden as dusk settled the air, cooling and carrying sounds farther than usual. I saw Kevin's silhouette through the living room window. He was pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. I couldn't see his face, but his posture was coiled with a desperate energy. His voice carried through the evening air, sharp and strained, and I froze. I only caught fragments, sharp little shards of a conversation not meant for me. Margin call. No, there's no more time. There was a long, terrible pause, and then the words that stopped my heart. The whole thing is coming down. I need to liquidate the asset by Friday. The asset. He wasn't talking about stocks or some abstract investment. He was in my house looking at my garden, talking about the one thing of value he could get his hands on. In that sickening, crystal clear moment, I understood. The asset was my home. The loving son was a desperate man, and I had just handed him the key. That night, sleep was a foreign country I had no visa for. The shock from the phone call had hardened into something cold and heavy in my chest. The grief was there, a deep, aching wound, where a mother's trust used to be, but the engineer in me was coming online. An engineer doesn't just stare at a catastrophic failure. She analyzes the data, isolates the variables, and formulates a plan. My son had presented me with a problem, a 5-day deadline to save my life's work from the person I'd built it for. I lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the house, my house, and I started running diagnostics. Their plan had one critical flaw. They thought I was a fragile old woman. They'd forgotten I spent 30 years at Intel surrounded by some of the sharpest, most competitive minds in the world. They had underestimated the asset. The next day, I made them lunch. I moved around the kitchen with a deliberate calm, making the salmon and arugula salad they both liked. I was the picture of a content, slightly dotty mother humming to myself. When we sat down, I let the silence hang for a moment before turning to Ashley. I kept my voice light casual, the way you'd ask about the weather. I told her I'd been thinking about that family trust, and a question had popped into my head. I said I thought I'd overheard Kevin on the phone with the lawyer mentioning something about the contingent beneficiary distribution. I just made the term up, but it sounded official enough. The effect was immediate. A fork clattered against Ashley's plate. Her eyes widened a flicker of pure, undiluted panic. She started to stammer, saying something about how it was all to make sure things were handled smoothly, that it was standard procedure. Her explanation was a word salad vague and meaningless. That's when Kevin walked in. He must have sensed the shift in the atmosphere because he immediately put on his brightest, most reassuring smile. He asked what we were talking about, and before Ashley could say another word, I repeated my innocent little question to him. He launched into a smooth, practiced answer, something about protecting the estate from probate court. It was a good answer, very convincing. But it was completely different from the panicked nonsense Ashley had just spewed. They hadn't rehearsed this part. I watched them exchange a look, a tiny, frantic glance that screamed their guilt louder than any confession. That was all the confirmation I needed. My probe had hit its target. The system was unstable. Later that afternoon, they told me they were going out for a few hours. I watched them leave from the window, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. Now, I moved quickly, avoiding the main living areas where I knew they had cameras. My destination was the garage, a place filled with 40 years of forgotten projects and dusty memories. In the back corner, under a pile of old gardening magazines, was a relic, an old beige landline phone, the kind with a coiled cord. I hadn't had it connected in over a decade, but the line itself was still physically there. I plugged it in. A dial tone. It was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. My hands were shaking, but I punched in the numbers from memory. It was a number I hadn't called in years. The phone rang twice, and then a familiar, no-nonsense voice answered. Eleanor. My friend and former office mate from Intel, now one of the most feared estate lawyers in the Bay Area. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the facts, the documents, the overheard call, the Friday deadline. I spoke like I was delivering a technical report. When I finished, there was a beat of silence. Then Eleanor's voice cold as ice. She said she'd be in touch, and that I should not, under any circumstances, let them know I'd spoken to anyone. Hope, fierce and bright, ignited inside me. I wasn't just an isolated old woman anymore. I had an ally. My brief moment of triumph didn't last long. When Kevin and Ashley came home, the mood had changed. The panic I'd seen in their eyes at lunch had curdled into a cold, watchful suspicion. They moved through the house with a new purpose. An hour later, Kevin came into the living room holding the old beige telephone by its cord, dangling it like a dead rat. He had a pained look on his face, the one he used when he was about to do something for my own good. He told me he'd been cleaning out the garage and found this old fire hazard and that he'd taken the liberty of getting rid of it. The next morning, Ashley insisted on sitting with me while I made my weekly call to my sister. Every word was monitored. Every pleasantry was scrutinized. They had cut my last secret line to the outside world. The realization settled over me with a chilling weight. They weren't just trying to steal my house anymore. They were scared. And because they were scared, they were turning my home into a prison. When you're a prisoner, your first job is to make your captors comfortable. So I began my performance. The sharp, analytical woman who had run diagnostics on her son's betrayal was packed away. In her place, I resurrected a character they would find far more believable, a frail, slightly confused old mother. I started asking Ashley to repeat things, complaining that my hearing wasn't what it used to be. I would stand in the middle of a room looking lost, as if I'd forgotten why I'd entered. I even apologized to Kevin for being so difficult about the trust documents, telling him I knew he was just trying to do what was best for me. I allowed them to help me up the stairs. I let them manage my meals. I played the part so well that I saw the tension drain from their shoulders. Their watchful suspicion was replaced by a kind of weary, condescending pity. They thought the brief storm had passed, that my moment of clarity had been nothing more than a flicker of confusion. They believed they had won. What they didn't know was that while their mother was fading away, a different person was taking her place. I saw it in Kevin, this toxic blend of relief and arrogance. He was in his sleek, glass-walled office in downtown Palo Alto, a space designed to project success. But the reflection in the dark screen of his monitor showed a man drowning. He stared at a string of emails, the subject lines like a drumbeat of doom: urgent, regarding seed investment; second legal notice; final demand for payment. The words blurred. His mind flashed back to the moment it had all gone wrong. It wasn't a shadowy figure in an alley. It was a charismatic man on a webinar, a guru with perfect teeth and a flawless pitch about a crypto arbitrage platform. He had charts, testimonials, and a proprietary algorithm that guaranteed returns. Kevin, who thought he was smarter than everyone who mocked the old ways of investing, had poured everything in the startup seed money, a second mortgage on his own condo. He remembered the euphoria of watching the numbers on the dashboard climb every single day. And then he remembered the gut-wrenching, stomach-twisting horror of the morning the website was just gone. The guru's social media was deleted. The money had vanished. All that was left was the shame and the terrifying, bottomless pit of debt. While they believed I was in my room taking my afternoon nap, I was at my battle station. Tucked away in my closet was another relic from my past, an old, heavy laptop from the early 2000s. It was slow and clunky, but I had kept it for one reason: it was a ghost. It had never been connected to their new smart home network. Using a secure VPN I'd paid for in cash years ago, I tunneled my way out of my digital prison. I logged into an account they knew nothing about. It was my real legacy, not this house. a portfolio I had started in the 70s with small, early investments in companies my colleagues were founding: Intel, Apple, Microsoft. Over 50 years, it had grown into a fortune that would make my son's venture capital dreams look like a child's lemonade stand. My screen filled with encrypted messages from Eleanor. We were building a case. We were tracing the fraudulent deed transfer. We were preparing the counteroffensive quietly, methodically, from the supposed sickbed of a confused old woman. Arrogance makes you careless. Kevin, so sure that he had me handled, started working from my house more often, using the dining room table as his office, so he could keep an eye on me. He was so focused on his next big move, on securing the funding that would save him from ruin, that he got sloppy. That afternoon, he was on a conference call, pacing in the garden, his voice a smooth river of tech jargon and false promises. He had left his laptop open on the table. For a moment, I just watched it, the screen glowing with opportunity. Then, moving with the slow, shuffling steps of my new persona, I walked over to the table as if to clear the dishes. My eyes dropped to the screen. It was his pitch deck, the presentation meant to dazzle his new investors. And there it was on slide 7 under the heading, Asset Leverage Strategy. A bullet point written in a clean corporate font that made my blood run cold. Collateralize existing real estate assets, Palo Alto property valued at 4.2 M, to secure bridge funding. It wasn't just a panicked plan anymore. It was a business strategy. It was the smoking gun, and my son had just handed it to me. It was Thursday morning. The clock was ticking, not just on the wall, but in my soul. Friday was the deadline. One more day until my son planned to sell my life from under me. I moved through the morning with the slow, deliberate motions of my assumed character, but inside I was a coiled spring. I had the evidence. I had the plan. I was just waiting for the signal. Kevin was at the dining room table, his back to the front door, tapping away at the same laptop that had betrayed him. He was radiating a new confidence, a manic energy of a man who thinks he's about to close the deal of a lifetime. He was so lost in his world of spreadsheets and projections that he barely flinched when the doorbell rang. He let out an annoyed sigh, clearly irritated by the interruption. Ashley went to get the door, expecting a package delivery. But it wasn't a delivery, it was Eleanor. She wasn't dressed like a friend coming for coffee. She was wearing a sharp, dark gray suit, her face set with the impassive focus of a surgeon. And she was not alone. Flanking her were 2 other people, a stern-looking man in a county official's jacket and a woman carrying a notary's briefcase. They stepped inside without being invited, their presence instantly changing the atmosphere in the room, from a quiet home to a courtroom. Kevin swiveled in his chair, his confident smirk faltering as he took in the scene. He started to ask what was going on, but Eleanor cut him off. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She placed a sheaf of papers on the table next to his laptop and informed him in a calm, level voice that he was being served with a temporary restraining order, effective immediately preventing him from transferring, selling, or borrowing against the property at this address. That was the first crack in his armor. The second came when Eleanor slid another document onto the table, a copy of the quitclaim deed I had signed. She pointed out the fraudulent nature of its acquisition. The final shattering blow came when she mentioned that we were also in possession of his latest investor pitch deck, specifically slide 7. I watched the color drain from my son's face. The charismatic tech founder, the confident visionary, the man who was always 3 steps ahead, he simply evaporated. What was left was a hollowed-out shell of terror. His carefully constructed world collapsed in on him in an instant, and he broke. It wasn't a dignified cry. It was a raw, guttural sob, that tore out of his chest, the sound of a man completely and utterly ruined. The confession came tumbling out not as a coherent story, but as a torrent of desperate, fragmented truths. He gasped out words about a crypto platform, about guaranteed returns, about the Ponzi scheme that had vaporized everything. He confessed to the second mortgage, the threatening lawsuits from his investors, the crippling, suffocating shame of it all. He wasn't talking to us. Not really. He was confessing to the universe, his words painting a pathetic picture of greed, gullibility, and the terrifying fear of being exposed as a failure in a world that worships success. Throughout this breakdown, Ashley stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief. She had been a willing accomplice in the deception, but I could see in her eyes that she never knew the reason why. She thought this was a power play, a strategic move to build a dynasty. She had no idea it was a desperate last-ditch attempt to plug a hole in a sinking ship. As Kevin's confession grew more pathetic, her shock curdled into horror and then into disgust. She looked at her husband, this weeping, broken man, as if seeing him for the first time. The illusion of the brilliant tech mogul she had married was gone, replaced by a common, foolish fraud. I saw her take a small, unconscious step away from him, a physical severing of their alliance. Their conspiracy, their united front against me, dissolved right there in my living room. There was no more us. There was just him and the wreckage he had made. In the ringing silence that followed his sobs, I stood up. The shuffle was gone from my step. The confused look was gone from my eyes. I walked over to the dining room table and looked down at my son. My voice when I spoke was not the frail, reedy tone he'd grown used to. It was the calm, clear voice of a senior engineer, the voice I used when a critical project was failing, and there was no more time for excuses. I told him to stop crying. I informed him that he would be coming with me and Eleanor to her office right now. There, he would sign a full, legally binding confession, and he would sign all the necessary documents to immediately and irrevocably reverse the fraudulent deed transfer. I told him this was not a negotiation. These were the first steps he would take to begin cleaning up the mess he had made. Kevin looked up at me, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. He wasn't looking at his dotty, manageable mother anymore. He was looking at the woman who had just taken back control of everything. He was powerless, and we both knew it. The drive to Eleanor's office was silent. Kevin sat in the back of Eleanor's car, a shrunken, hollowed-out version of the man who had breezed into my house a few weeks ago. Ashley had refused to come, simply turning and walking up the stairs without a word, a silent abdication from the life she had helped build. At the office, under the cold fluorescent lights of a conference room, Kevin signed everything without protest, a full confession detailing the fraud, the investment scam, and his motivations, and a second set of documents that immediately nullified the quitclaim deed, returning my home to its rightful owner. Legally, my house was safe. But I knew this wasn't over. Justice isn't just about reclaiming what was lost. It's about ensuring the system that failed is fundamentally corrected. My son's system was broken. His entire world was built on a foundation of image hype and the desperate fear of being seen as ordinary. The family meeting I had mentioned was never going to be enough. To teach him the lesson he needed to learn, I had to meet him in his own arena. A week later, I walked into the boardroom of his startup, Innovate Next. The name itself felt like a parody. The room was exactly as you'd imagine. A long, polished concrete table, minimalist chairs, and a wall of glass overlooking the frantic energy of Silicon Valley. Around the table sat 4 venture capitalists, men in their 40s, who wore expensive casual clothing like a uniform and radiated an aura of impatient, world-changing importance. I was a complete anomaly. a 70-year-old woman in a simple cardigan. My presence was made possible by 2 phone calls to old friends men I'd worked with at Intel in the 70s, men whose names were now whispered with reverence in this town. They had vouched for me, and so I was granted a seat at the table, introduced only as a private investor with deep industry experience. The board members gave me a polite, dismissive nod before turning their attention to Kevin, who stood at the head of the table looking like a ghost about to haunt his own life. He began his pitch. He was trying to secure a new round of funding, the very funding he'd planned to get, by leveraging my home. His voice was thin, stripped of its usual charismatic boom. He spoke the familiar language of disruption synergy and scalable solutions, but the words were just empty shells. He was a puppet reciting lines from a play that had already ended. He got to slide 7, the slide that had been his undoing. As he took a breath to speak, I calmly raised my hand. A flicker of annoyance crossed the lead investor's face, but I ignored him and kept my eyes fixed on my son. I told the room that I had a few questions about the company's financial health and asset management. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the stale air-conditioned room. I started by asking about the asset leverage strategy mentioned in his own presentation. Then, with methodical precision, I presented my case. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show any anger. I spoke as if I were delivering a post-mortem on a failed project. I laid out the facts, the fraudulent acquisition of a private Palo Alto residence to be used as collateral, the misappropriation of the company's seed money into a high-risk, unvetted crypto platform, the subsequent total loss of that capital, and the pending lawsuits from his initial investors. I had documents for everything, which Eleanor's associate, a young, sharp-looking man, placed neatly in front of each board member. The judgment, when it came, was silent and absolute. I watched the faces of the 4 investors transform. Their polite boredom shifted to sharp-eyed focus, then to stunned disbelief, and finally it settled into a look of cold, unified disgust. This wasn't the kind of failure they were used to, a failed product, a missed market that was business. But this was something else. This was sordid, pathetic, and deeply personal. They weren't just looking at a founder who had made a bad bet. They were looking at a man who had tried to defraud his own mother to cover his tracks. In their world, that wasn't just a moral failing. It was a sign of catastrophic instability. I saw them subtly slide their iPads away. I saw the lead investor slowly, deliberately close his pen. No notes would be taken today. No deal would be made. In that silent, crushing consensus, my son's professional identity was executed. His reputation, the only currency that truly mattered to him, was rendered worthless. Into that heavy silence, I delivered the consequences. I announced that this was at its heart a family matter and that I would be handling it as such, which meant no criminal charges would be filed. I saw a flicker of relief in Kevin's dead eyes. It didn't last long. I then informed the board that to protect the interests of the original investors and to salvage what was left of the company's technology, I would be stepping in. I told them that my deep industry experience came with significant capital and that I would be personally leading a new round of funding. This funding would first be used to make every single one of his original investors whole. Then it would be used to restructure the company under new leadership. I was taking a controlling interest. I was not destroying his company. I was taking it away from him. My final words were for my son. I told him he would stay on in a non-leadership role and that he would work under my supervision to help clean up the mess he had made. The message was clear. I was saving him from prison, but I was revoking his power. He would never again be in a position of control. He had lost his company, his reputation, and his home all in one afternoon. And in their place, he had been given a chance to earn his way back, not to the top, but to zero. The fallout in Silicon Valley was as swift and silent as a software update pushed out overnight. There was no public spectacle, no dramatic news story. That's not how this world works. Instead, a sterile, jargon-filled press release announced that Kevin was stepping down as CEO of Innovate Next for personal reasons, effective immediately. The truth traveled through a more efficient network, the back channels of venture capitalists, the quiet conversations between board members, the subtle shift in social invitations. My son, who had lived his life chasing status, became a ghost. He was no longer a player. He was a cautionary tale, a whisper at cocktail parties about the founder who crashed and burned in the most spectacularly personal way imaginable. The world he had worshipped, with its ruthless obsession with success, simply erased him. He was left with the one thing he had always feared most: silence. The true collapse, however, happened not in a boardroom, but in the quiet of his own condo. Ashley left him. There was no screaming match, no dramatic confrontation. From what I pieced together later, it was a departure of quiet, devastating finality. She packed her bags while he sat on the sofa, staring at a blank television screen, and then she was gone. She had signed up to be the wife of a visionary, a tech mogul in the making. She had not signed up for the quiet shame of being married to a disgraced fraud who had been publicly dismantled by his own mother. Her leaving was the final stripping away of his armor. Without his title, his reputation, or his wife, there was nothing left for him to hide behind. He was forced to confront the man he had become alone in the echo chamber of his failures. A few weeks later, I received an email from him. It was just one sentence. "I'm sorry, Mom. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a redemption. But it was the first honest thing he had said in years, and I knew it was the beginning of a long, painful, and necessary road for him." While his world was shrinking, mine was expanding in ways I never thought possible. The crisis had shaken me out of a quiet retirement and reminded me of the woman I used to be. I started having weekly lunches with Eleanor and our old friends from the Intel days. We were a cohort of pioneers, women and men, who had laid the foundational stones of this valley, and we found we still had a lot to talk about and a lot to do. The vast fortune I had quietly accumulated over the decades was no longer just a number in a secret portfolio. It became a tool. I started a small foundation, a mentorship program for brilliant young engineers who had great ideas but lacked the connections or the capital. I wasn't interested in unicorns or billion-dollar exits. I was interested in ethical technology and sustainable ideas, in supporting young people who wanted to build things that lasted rather than just cash out. My life found a new purpose, a new rhythm. My legacy, I realized, was never going to be this house. It was the wisdom I could share, the integrity I could model. Months have passed. It's a warm Saturday afternoon in late spring, and my garden is alive. The roses are in full bloom, and the air is filled with the smell of barbecue and the sound of laughter. The faces around my patio table are young, eager, and brilliant, the first group of engineers my foundation is supporting. They're arguing passionately about the future of machine learning and sketching out ideas on napkins. My home, which for a short, dark time had felt like a prison, is now what it was always meant to be: a hub of creativity, a place of safety and innovation. I watch them, a new generation dreaming up a new world, and I feel a profound sense of peace. I survived. More than that, I transformed. The pain I endured was not a final destination. It was a crucible that burned away the non-essential and left behind what truly matters. I have my home, my friends, and a new chosen family. My son is on his own journey, one I can only hope leads him to a place of peace. And I am here in the heart of the world I helped build, finally living a legacy, not just protecting one. In the end, it was never truly about revenge. It was about a fundamental correction. Linda Wang showed that a legacy built on hype and fear is as fragile as glass. Her son chased a glittering image, but she stood on the solid ground of integrity. The ultimate lesson wasn't in his public fall, but in the quiet, difficult chance she gave him to rebuild from zero. She taught him that true value isn't found in a pitch deck or a funding round, but in the character you build when no one is watching. It was a painful, necessary lesson in truth.